Around the world, in basically every country, in the wake of the COVID crisis and the supply crunch afterwards, nearly every advanced economy has experienced inflation. Understandably, nearly every public in those nations has not liked it and expressed their frustration, often by voting against incumbents. Now, Donald Trump is with it enough still, I think, to understand those basic facts. So he has been constantly railing against inflation, trying to blame it on the Biden and Harris administration. But if you listen to what he suggests actually doing about it, it just makes no sense.
On my first day back in the Oval Office, I will sign an executive order directing every cabinet secretary and agency head to use every tool and authority at their disposal to defeat inflation and to bring consumer prices rapidly down. We'll do it very rapidly. We're going to have 10 to 20% tariffs on foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years. We're going to charge them 10 to 20% to come in and take advantage of our country, because that's what they've been doing for nothing.
Okay, did you catch that? This is his one central inflation-fighting policy proposal. Enormous tariffs on every imported good. In other words, a sales tax on stuff that already costs a lot. Clothes, iPhones, you name it. It would increase the cost of those goods. Yesterday, after a round of golf and a chat with the MyPillow guy, because of course Trump tried again, he stepped out of his Bedminster, New Jersey summer home to point and gawk at a box of Cheerios and other grocery items, again, without articulating any actual coherent plan to bring down the price of those items. In fact, economists say that what passes for so-called Trumponomics could actually cause inflation to spike. Now, today, in marked contrast, Kamala Harris unveiled her economic agenda, and it is a tangible set of policies focused on lowering consumer costs.
I will work to pass the first ever federal ban on price gauging on food. I'll lower the cost of insulin and prescription drugs for everyone. By the end of my first term, we will end America's housing shortage by building 3 million new homes and rentals that are affordable for the middle class. Under my plan, more than 100 million Americans will get a tax cut, and we will do this by restoring 2 tax cuts designed to help middle class and working Americans: the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit.
Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont calls the vice president's new economic agenda bold and popular, and he joins me now. Senator, obviously, campaigns usually have a while to get started. This one is in a completely different category. They're kind of building the airplane while flying it. And I think there's some real question about when the meat got put on the bones, right? When you're saying, OK, here's the substantive stuff, here's the policy, we're putting out the papers and speeches, what it would look like. What's your reaction to what was unveiled today?
Well, I think given the fact that she has been a candidate for only 3 weeks, I think she's doing really, really well in a whole lot of ways. I think what she laid out today was a strong, progressive agenda, obviously, in the weeks and months to come. I think she's going to add more specificity to some of these proposals, and she's going to add to it. But, Chris, I have always believed that good policy is good politics. And what she is talking about today is reining in the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs. That's enormously popular, the right thing to do. She's talking about building 3 million units of affordable housing at a time when we have a housing crisis in Burlington, Vermont, Los Angeles, California, and every place in between. We got to lower the cost of housing in America. She's talking about ending medical debt so that a quarter of the people in this country who have cancer do not have to deplete their savings or go bankrupt. So I think she's talking about controlling the cost of groceries when we know that there's been massive concentration of ownership in that industry. They spike prices up, and going after them is exactly the right thing to do and very good politics.
I want to talk about the housing because it's been very striking to me. The first campaign ad, one of the first campaign ads from the Harris campaign mentioned 2 issues: prescription drugs, cost of housing. talking about sort of using sort of policy mechanisms to cap rental increases for big corporate landlords, talking about building new supply today. In my time covering Democratic politics, I have never seen housing and the cost of housing more central in a presidential campaign than I've seen it just, I would say, in the first few weeks of the Harris campaign. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think many of us have been negligent in really perceiving the nature of the housing crisis in America. I got it now. I mean, I've been out in every place I go, Chris. People say we can't find affordable housing, homelessness, 600,000 people. So I think she's absolutely right to talk about that issue as well as the high cost of prescription drugs.
There was an interesting kind of ideological tug of war that was happening in this period where the President Joe Biden said he's not going to seek the nomination. Kamala Harris became the nominee, about what her economic vision would be. And particularly some of it centered on Lina Khan, who's the head of the FTC and has been very, very aggressive in fighting antitrust, big conglomerates. Do you feel like you have a better sense of that? This seemed to me a full-throated endorsement of Lina Khan's work at the FTC, of going after concentration in big corporations.
Well, Chris, as you know, there were some Democratic donors, big money interests, who don't like the work that Lina Khan is doing. I happen to think she's the best FTC chair that we have had for a very, very long time. And if Kamala Harris is going to be successful in taking on corporate greed, in taking on concentration of ownership, she's going to need somebody like Lina Khan at the head of the FTC.
Finally, Senator, do you think that the price issue still sort of crowds everything out in people's perception of the economy the way it did, say, 6 months ago, a year ago?
Well, inflation is going down, but I think especially when you walk into a grocery store, people are legitimately concerned. And by the way, Chris, one of the other issues that she talked about today was the expansion of the child tax credit and making it permanent.
Yep.
In the American Rescue Plan, we, by doing that, cut childhood poverty in America by over 40%. One provision in one bill. You make that permanent, we deal with the outrage that in the richest country in the world, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country. So paying attention to the needs of parents and kids is enormously important, and I'm glad she's doing that.
Senator Bernie Sanders, thank you for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
I can't say what was there, who was there. I can only tell you about ours. We have the biggest crowds ever in the history of politics.
The largest crowd of the campaign showed up in Detroit, Michigan. You know, it's not as if anybody cares about crowd sizes or anything.
Trump is bothered by the size of Kamala Harris's crowds, because it's a language that he actually understands, a sign of enthusiasm more visceral and immediate than fundraising or polls. Today, a Democratic strategist going even further, saying he sees the stirrings of a, quote, movement, telling Politico, quote, Harris could be at a point where she's a head of a movement, which is bigger than a candidate, and that's pretty much unstoppable. A movement, meaning something bigger than daily politics. And indeed, the energy at Harris rallies and the sheer size of the crowds at times appears to rival the kind of energy at music concerts or football games, events that transcend politics.
If you've got something to say, say it to my face. I know Donald Trump's type. We say, bring it on. Bring it on. Bring it on. Yes, we're ready. We're ready. Not going back. We're not going back. We are not going back.
It's that football game style energy that's unnerving Trump. And the Harris campaign knows it. Harris herself highlighting running mate Tim Walz's background as a high school football coach.
To his former high school football players, he was coach. For some folks, they're just getting to know Coach Walz's story. Coach Walz taught social studies. Students voted Coach Walz the, quote, most inspiring faculty member. The kind of coach, because he's the kind of person who makes people feel like they belong. It was Coach Walz's students who actually helped him decide to run for office. Coach Walz and I may hail from different corners of our great country, but our values are the same. Under those Friday night lights, Coach Walz motivated his players to believe they could achieve anything.
The New York Times surfacing this video showing Walz coaching in the 1999 Minnesota State Championship game, which they went on to win. The best-selling author of Friday Night Lights, which went on to become a hit movie and a TV show, is now writing about Walz in the 2024 campaign, arguing that in many towns in America, a high school football coach is charged with, quote, pushing kids to realize their potential. He can be responsible for the town and how the town feels about itself, bringing pride and excitement to a place that sometimes has little of either. He explicitly compares Walz with the fictional high school coach in Friday Night Lights, Eric Taylor, known for his stand-up character and inspiring halftime speeches.
I expect you boys to go out there and not take this team lightly, because I promise you, they're going to come at you with everything they've got. I expect you boys to execute. Yes, sir. Expect you boys to play football. Yes, sir. Clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose.
In real life, Walz's former players have recently spoken out, quote, you knew Coach Walz had confidence in you, and, quote, he never belittled people, never lost his cool, and, quote, he brought us together. The inspirational halftime speeches in the show also doubled as life lessons about how to fight bullies, how to stage a comeback, and how to work together and be a part of a team. On the campaign trail, Walz is invoking some of that as well.
I talk about it being halftime in America. We're a touchdown down, and I kind of like the idea of being a little bit behind.
Well, I'm looking at Coach Walz right now.
You build culture. You build
That's
winning.
right.
People want to be a part of it. And
yeah.
That's the excitement. That's the excitement of what it can be.
That's how I feel about our campaign.
In his new piece about Tim Walz, Friday Night Lights author Buzz Bissinger writes, quote, coaching can maybe carry over into politics, not just as an approach to winning or to motivating people, but in excelling at the details and responsibilities that go beyond merely X's and O's.
This game is not over. This battle is not over. So let's hear it one more time. Together. Clear eyes, full hearts.
Let's go!
Joining me now is Buzz Bissinger. Sorry, I have to wipe a tear. Author of Friday Night Lights, the book that inspired the TV show. He has a new piece for the New York Times. Quote, I wrote Friday Night Lights. Here's why Coach Tim Walz stands apart. Buzz, I'll just start with asking, What inspired you to write this piece? Were you always sort of paying attention to the campaign very closely? Was it something in particular about Tim Walz? What inspired you to write this piece?
Well, I mean, I certainly pay attention to the campaign. It's really when the presidential nominee Harris said the words Friday Night Lights. I mean, that kind of pricked up my ears because I did write the book and was the originator of the phrase. And as you pointed out in the previous segment, I kept hearing Coach Walz, Coach Walz, Coach Walz, Coach Walz. And first of all, he was not the head coach. So at the end of the day, he does not carry the total responsibility for the team. But otherwise, you would think he'd been a coach all his life and then sort of accidentally became the vice presidential nominee. And he seems, by all accounts, to be decent, kind, compassionate. But, you know, coaches are different breeds. And I think that our image of a coach is really based on the television show. You saw the clips. You know, you have Kyle Chandler playing Coach Taylor. He's perfect. You know, he's perfect, much like that phrase. He's kind, he's decent, he knows his X's and O's, he doesn't personalize. It's not just winning for the sake of winning, but, you know, that's a Hollywood image. And my experience with coaches is actually, you know, quite different. The pressure on winning is enormous in this country, and I think it's getting worse. And when there is pressure to win, particularly in the big-time high school programs, there's a likelihood you're going to cut corners because, let's face it, you don't win, you're out.
And Axios today is giving a name to what we've been seeing play out in the polling and the headlines really since 2016. Quote, Donald Trump's caught on tape women problem. The classics like crazy, unhinged, and nasty. He now calls Harris low IQ, compounded in the 2024 election by multiple comments resurfacing from J.D. Vance, his VP pick, on what the purpose of postmenopausal women is and so-called childless cat ladies, although he would argue about the premenopausal, postmenopausal women line. Why it matters, according to Axios, quote, women are more reliable voters than men, and polls suggest they'll reliably vote by big margins for Vice President Harris. Joining us now, former Special Assistant to President Biden and former Director of Message Planning, Megan Hayes. I do want to say that J.D. Vance, when the host of that podcast said that the point of postmenopausal women was to take care of kids, they claim that J.D. Vance, when he said yes to that, thought that the host was going to go in a different direction. So that's their explanation for that comment. But there are a whole host of other comments that J.D. Vance has made about women that implies that he believes their highest and greatest purpose is having children, not working. There's a gender divide here, and Harris is so far doing so well with women, and Donald Trump is really going after male voters. When you look at this play out, how do you combat it? Do you try to go after men as well if you're Kamala Harris, or do you double down on women?
Double down on women as well as go after men. So I think you need to do both, right? You can't leave any group unaffected here. Everyone is a voter. Everyone is, especially in these swing states. But I do think the polling is showing that her favorability with women is going up, which is a really positive thing. Moving into the election also with abortion and reproductive freedoms on the ballot in a lot of these swing states, that's a really positive sign for her. But I don't think you can leave men and not address some of their issues as well. But also men have moms and daughters and wives and sisters. So they also are impacted by some of these statements that are just downright offensive. So, I mean, I don't think you can not do both.
How do you do both? What is the message that cuts through?
Look, I think you can talk to women about these things that J.D. Vance are saying that are offensive, but also men care about the economy, too. Men care about cutting costs. These are all, kitchen table issues that the vice president is addressing. So I think when they start talking about the issues, I think folks will start these independent voters will start to come home and, they will really be impactful in the swing states.
There's been talk that Kamala Harris needs to ride the vibe more, ride personality more, don't get too heavy into policy. Voters really aren't paying all that much attention into the nitty gritty of policy, stuff that would leave her open to lines of attack from Republicans. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think that people want to feel good about the future and people want to have hope in the future. And I think that that's one thing that the vice president and the governor are doing. They're providing hope for people. They're not, there's an option now that's not looking backwards. And Donald Trump goes out there and says really negative things. He lives in the past. He talks about, the president and Hillary Clinton, and he's always talking about how he's the one that has been attacked unfairly, which is just false. But so people want to vote on their feelings and want to feel good about moving into the future. But part of that is the policies and part of that is the economic strategy, just like you just saw the vice president laying out her economic plan or parts of her economic plan moving forward. So she has to weigh into the policy, but I think she does get to ride some vibes here about moving, people positively into the future.
Is there something specific that you heard today from her that you think she should focus on more going forward?
think she needs to keep talking about how she's going to cut costs for the middle class and bring the middle class along. I think that a lot of people have been really impacted by the cost of groceries, the cost of gas in the last couple of years. And I think that with the inflation coming down and some of the other things that the administration is doing, she should continue to do that and then take it a step further. So I do think, she is providing some of that guidance. And I think that she should continue to talk about how she's going to make lives and the future better for the middle class.
Megan Hayes, really good to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Joining me now is Republican strategist Susan Del Percio, Adam Jentleson, the former chief of staff to Senator John Fetterman and the former deputy chief of staff to Senator Harry Reid, and former advisor to President Biden's 2020 campaign, Alencia Johnson. Susan, let's start with you, and I want to show you a new Quinnipiac poll this week that shows in the battleground of Pennsylvania, women are backing Harris over Trump 54 to 41%, whereas men support Trump by a 7-point margin. The comments we're hearing from Donald Trump about Kamala Harris and from J.D. Vance about women more generally, can they pivot this to make a point and inroads with women voters who clearly are going to be an important part of who decides the next president?
They can try, but as we've been discussing and will continue to discuss, Donald Trump's not going to change. He's not going to stop being a bully. He's not going to stop going to Georgia and making fun of the very popular governor's, Republican governor's wife. Those are the things that turn off independent and especially women voters. Donald Trump is banking on two things, crime and the economy, as far as issues to go after those suburban women. But right now, it's not going to be enough because in many states we have abortion on the ballot. And also, Donald Trump is just turning them off in droves, similar to what he did in 2020.
And Alencia, Vice President Harris could see a boost from a powerful voting bloc, and that is black women. She is a proud member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, so as a result, she has unique access to millions of members of the Divine Nine Greek organization. Tell us more about that, and how will that connection help her across the country?
Well, I'm one of those 2.4 million Divine Nine members. I am a Delta. And let me be honest that our group chats are fired up and talking about wearing our colors at convention, on election day, on inauguration day. And soon after it came out that she was the nominee, you saw the Divine Nine organizations, who are nonprofits, talking about voter mobilization. And then you saw some of them, like the Delta for Action, the Alpha PAC, which is fraternity, I believe the AKAs, their PAC as well, also endorsing Kamala Harris, along with other members of the Greek letter organizations that are running for office. And so you will see this contingent not only mobilizing their members, also, they are leaders and influential folks in their own communities, so they will continue to mobilize a lot more Black voters within their service areas and beyond.
Adam, Vice President Harris, she is getting support from these different voting blocs, but there is a worry that she's losing a contingent of older white voters who supported President Biden at the top of the ticket. What can the Harris campaign do to hold on to them?
Well, I think, first of all, it's not clear that concern is really grounded in a lot of data so far. The numbers so far have been holding relatively steady, even as she has improved with other blocks like young voters, non-white voters, and women voters over President Biden's performance. So we have to wait and see if those losses really do manifest. But I think there's a lot of things she can do. She's been very smart so far about signaling moderation across a number of issues. She's been running aggressively on border security, on her own role that she did play as vice president in reducing border crossings over the past couple of years. Border crossings are way down. There was a story recently about how Governor Abbott of Texas, who's been famous for shipping migrants to other cities and putting them on buses, he is having trouble filling the buses right now because there are so few border crossings, and border crossings are down so much because of some of the actions Vice President Harris has taken. So I think she's mindful of that risk and is being very smart so far in addressing issues like border security that are important to those blocks of voters. And I think we'll continue to see that probably next week at the convention and as this campaign moves into the fall.
So, Susan, we are now anticipating the first debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It's less than a month away. ABC announced today that it'll be held at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. How would you advise either candidate as they start preparing for their first meeting?
Well, Trump's hopeless. Let's put it that way. We know he's not going to prepare. He'll do a little, and then he's just going to yell and scream and go around and stalk the vice president on TV if he repeats his performance from 2016 with Hillary Clinton. When it comes to the vice president, I think she has a lot of that training built in as a prosecutor. I think we're going to see her make her case. And what is so important for the vice president in this debate is to really come home to voters under 40, but even more so voters between 18 and 25. They're really looking at her now and being motivated to vote for her. They weren't necessarily ever going to really go for Trump, but they were staying on the couch when it came to Biden. Now they're active. I think that should be more of her target as far as that goes, because she is actually doing well with voters over 65, 70 years old. The problem where Trump does well for her is in the people in their 50s.
Alencia, there's always a danger in a debate with Donald Trump because he is not afraid to go after someone personally. He said yesterday that he believes he has license to attack Kamala Harris personally. How does she respond if those personal attacks come, not just during the debate, but in these weeks leading up to the debate, and then when she is there face-to-face against him on the stage?
Well, I've noticed over the past few weeks when he makes the personal attacks, she gets down to business. She talks about his policies and calls him a bully. I do think that in the debate, of course, he is going to have the personal attacks. We saw what he was doing to Secretary Hillary Clinton. But if I was him, I'd be pretty scared because I remember Vice President Harris when she was senator and prosecuting the case when people were at the judiciary hearings. And I think that is what you're going to see from her, shut him down, kind of like she did Vice President Pence, telling him that she was speaking and to stop interrupting her, and then moving forward with very real policy.
And Adam, there is some new polling from ABC that shows that more Americans are paying attention to what's happening in this debate, and they have more of a favorable impression of Tim Walz than they do of J.D. Vance. What impact is the bottom of the ticket going to have in this race coming up?
Well, I think, vice presidential picks typically don't have a major impact on the race. I think Vice President Harris will win or lose this on her own merits, and so far she is winning. But, it is the first major decision that she's had to make as the de facto or presumptive nominee. And I think the evidence shows that she made a great decision here. Governor Walz has proven extremely popular, much more popular than his Republican counterpart, who is already creating major headaches for the Trump campaign. He's proven a very adept campaigner. He's great on the stump. He's funny. And he clearly enjoys the job. They always say interviews for the job you want, and he really clearly wants this job.
Joining us for more on this conversation is Zerlina Maxwell, host of Mornings with Zerlina on SiriusXM, and Brendan Buck, former press secretary to former House Speakers Boehner and Ryan. He is an MSNBC political analyst. Zerlina, just polling this week that shows a majority of voters trusting Trump over the vice president when it comes to the economy. Now, the vice president did edge out Trump in one outlier, a Financial Times poll, but what do you think the vice president has to do to close that gap?
I think she has to talk more about the economy, and you'll see that today when she's talking about the specifics. I think she needs to lay out a vision for how she's planning to tackle some of the most important issues top of mind for American voters, like housing and grocery costs, but also the cost of childcare and supporting paid family leave, things that parents and families are thinking about every single day as they go through their bank books and their bills and try to make ends meet. And I think that, it's about setting out a vision that is in a stark contrast to Donald Trump and his vision when he can talk specifics, which is rare. And I think that once she does that, I think these numbers will shift a bit. A lot of folks are unfamiliar with what the vice president has been doing for the last 4 years. And while the big picture and some of the economic indicators obviously have improved since the crash during COVID, I think people are slow to feel that every single day. And so it's on her to lay out her vision so that people understand how her policies will help them on the day-to-day basis.
And Zerlina, how does she either separate herself or join these last 4 years of the Biden administration's economic record?
Well, I think that she needs to remind folks where we were when Biden and Harris went into the White House. I think that one of the disturbing things Donald Trump does is try to change history and erase our memories of where the economy actually was when he left the White House. Well, when he was forced to leave the White House, because as we know, he did not want to leave. The economy crashed at the end of COVID. Now, the pandemic is not Donald Trump's fault, but he did not address many of the things that needed to be done in terms of keeping Americans safe so that the economy did not crash. Biden and Harris inherited that flailing economy, and they've built it back up step by step. And I think it's important to remind Americans that as Donald Trump tries to rewrite that history and say that he gave Biden a great economy, no, he did not. That is flatly untrue. And every single person knows that.
And Brendan, this, as the former president, is trying to, I guess, sharpen his attacks on Vice President Harris's economic record. Here's some of what he had to say yesterday.
She's running on the Maduro plan. We call it the Maduro plan, like something straight out of Venezuela or the Soviet Union. People don't respect her in the economy. Economists are laughing. They can't even believe this is happening to our country. And she wants to change a free enterprise type country into a communist type country. That's what she knows. She's considered far more radical than Bernie Sanders. That's all you have to know.
Brennan, how effective do you think this line of attack is going to be?
So that event yesterday could have been really good. I mean, they started off really focused on the price increases that people have shown in polls over and over again are they're really concerned about. And I don't know that Kamala Harris has a great answer for inflation. And she's putting out some policies to address that, I guess, this week. But that is a very good issue for Donald Trump. And he started off really focused on it. But then, as tends to happen, Donald Trump gets bored with his talking points. And so he deviates and goes into all of the greatest hits and starts talking about all these crazy things, and it gets lost. It would not be hard to be a Republican candidate right now and put a lot of pressure on Kamala Harris on the economy, make her respond, make her feel the heat. But he is so self-indulgent in talking about all these other random things that it doesn't break through. And so she never really has to respond to anything. It's another missed opportunity. I think it's why a lot of Republicans are frustrated with his lack of discipline. I don't know it's going to change anytime soon. This is kind of who he is. But it was a perfect symbol of how a campaign that has so many opportunities keeps blowing them at every opportunity.
Zerlina, a new op-ed in the Washington Post reads in part, quote, if your opponent claims you're communist, maybe don't start with an economic agenda that can accurately be labeled as federal price controls. Could this plan backfire on the vice president?
I don't think this plan is going to backfire on the vice president. I think that a lot of Americans are concerned with prices, and they do understand viscerally that price gouging is a real thing that is happening. And so implementing the power of the federal government to control the gouging and ripping off of the American public as they go to the grocery store every day, I think that that's something that will resonate with plenty of American families. I would also say that American families are concerned about housing and grocery prices, as you'll hear the vice president talk about. But as I said, they're also concerned with the care economy. And so I think that as she lays out this economic vision later today, she'll also begin to talk about the care economy, like affordable child care, paid family leave, and also the type of care that so many folks who have kids and also aging parents have to deal with, and really create a care economy that helps support American families who are feeling that pinch and don't have enough resources.
And Brendan, earlier this week, I'm just thinking of your comments about just how he is not able to focus on specific issues and keep that message as a focused one. Earlier this week, Nikki Haley warned that Trump can't win by attacking Harris personally and urged him to focus on issues. Here's how he responded to that.
I think I'm doing a very calm campaign. I mean, we're here. There's no shouting. I think I appreciate her advice. I have to do it my way. I ran against her, and I did it my way.
So doesn't seem like, Brendan, he's even considering that anything that he says is not focused.
He is convinced that his political success is all from his own genius as a political operator. My personal view is he won in 2016 because a lot of people didn't like Hillary Clinton. And then, of course, he lost the second time that he ran. As much as he was defeating Joe Biden recently, it was mostly a function of the fact that people just didn't think Joe Biden was up for it. And it wasn't that Donald Trump himself was actually that great. His numbers have never been all that great. So he's never going to change that. He doesn't think more attention for himself, more outrageous things, playing the old hits is always going to work because he surrounds himself with people for whom that's great. He loves going to those rallies and throwing those lines out and having everybody laugh at him. Like that's what feeds him. So he's not going to change how he does that. And that's the circle that we find ourselves in. When you never get out of your bubble, you never realize that there are other people who react differently to the kind of things you say. And talking about your crowd sizes may rile up the people in front of you, but it does absolutely nothing for the people who are going to decide this election. I don't know that he can change who he is, though.
Fernand, as we look ahead to the Harris event this afternoon, just how important is it for Harris to lay out her economic vision today?
Well, I think it's important because the economy was really the one issue that was stymieing Joe Biden when he was the Democratic nominee. Americans, despite the pretty strong economic indicators, the strong economic record by the Biden administration, weren't necessarily buying that. So not only the fact that you see Kamala Harris laser focusing on this issue, the fact that she's also undoubtedly a much better messenger at this point. She has the ability to communicate very effectively, very passionately. And I think her team sees if they can move the needle on the economy, and polls are starting to show now, Anna, that voters trust Kamala Harris slightly more than Joe Biden. That means that they're going to be able to grow their support. By contrast, you see a very undisciplined, chaotic Donald Trump who only really knows how to function in chaos. Yesterday, try and kind of knock him down a peg or two, really unable to reach that goal because Trump is what Trump is. He's a victim of insults. He likes that style, and that's going to be the approach that we're going to see for the next 30 or 60 days. He's not going to change.
And that's what he's saying. He's saying that out loud, that I'm going to do it my way. Congressman, as mentioned, the polling on the economy as an issue for voters is showing Trump ahead, but that gap is closing with Harris on the ticket. What should Republicans read from that?
Well, Anna, it just is another example of the fact that Donald Trump might be the most undisciplined presidential candidate in history because you hear congressional Republicans, you hear political strategists. We know what his team is telling him. They're telling him to focus on the economy, inflation, and immigration. Those are the issues that could really propel Republicans to victory in 2024. But a reminder, Anna, those were the same issues that could have generated a big red wave for Republicans in 22, which a lot of people predicted. Why did that not materialize? In large part because Donald Trump decided to intervene in that 22 race and make it about the big lie about the 2020 election. That threw Republicans off message, and it really hurt their ability to make the gains that they were supposed to make that cycle. So we're saying the same thing over and over again. We're seeing it here. Donald Trump working as hard as he can to keep that coalition that rejected the MAGA movement in 18, 20, and 22 together to possibly defeat him again in 24.
Well, speaking of potential messaging issues, Congressman, Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, has been on the trail this week and has really been trying to highlight military issues, trying to connect with military families, with veterans. But then Trump says this.
I have to say, Miriam, I watched Sheldon sitting so proud in the White House when we gave Miriam the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the highest award you can get as a civilian. It's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, but civilian version. It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets, or they're dead.
Congressman Curbelo, your reaction to that?
This, number one, what a horrible thing to say. Number two, this is exactly the type of statement, the type of conduct that turns off the swing voters in suburban America that defeated Trump 3 elections in a row, the MAGA movement, 18, 20, and 22. Again, Anna, this is Donald Trump being his own worst enemy, keeping that anti-Trump coalition together. A lot of people say, well, maybe he'll change course. This is who Donald Trump is. He hasn't changed in all these years, and I think it's unlikely to happen in the next couple months.
And not to mention, isn't he undermining the message of his own running mate, who can speak with, I guess, some gravitas on the issue, given his own experience in the military?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I mean, to think about that contrast with not just J.D. Vance, who he's undermining, but Tim Walz, and any American who wore the uniform, any Gold Star parent who lost someone in combat. I mean, just repugnant comments by a repugnant person. Anna, I think the other thing that really needs to be stated here that Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand, the one advantage that he had in 2016 is what he was then, what I call a political Rorschach test candidate. A lot of voters justified their personal discomfort with him and his rhetoric by saying, well, yeah, at least he's a businessman. I think he's going to shake things up. I think he's going to do things a lot better. Voters have now seen the product. And as Congressman Curbelo says, the reaction to the product they saw in 2018, 2020, and 2022 was a rejection of that. So that's why Trump continuing to stay the course with this 2016 over-the-top approach, not only is it going bad for him, I think it's going to cause a massive loss across the country, especially now with the new energized Harris-Walz ticket capturing the imagination of voters across the country.
Veterans, people without kids, postmenopausal women. Fernand, how many different groups has the GOP ticket collectively potentially alienated in the last few weeks?
All of them, all of them. That's why you see all of a sudden all of these groups mushrooming overnight. Veterans for Harris on Zoom, childless cat ladies for Harris on Zoom. All of these little groups, because of the constant 24-hour Death Star alienation campaign that the Trump-Vance ticket just delights in seeming to do. Again, that stuff may work on Fox News and conservative media. It doesn't play with non-Trump voters and non-Trump supporters.
Trump is also back to false election claims, trying to stir up doubts about election integrity. Congressman, new Republican-backed laws in states like Georgia seem tailor-made to block certification in the event of a Harris win. If Trump and his allies try to ignore or even overturn the election results again if they lose, are there enough establishment Republicans left to stop it?
I think there are, Anna. In Congress in 2020, we did see a lot of Republicans, not enough in my opinion, but a lot stand up and say, no, we're not going to embrace this lie. It does concern me that Mitch McConnell, while he will still be in Congress, is not going to be in a leadership position anymore, because he certainly did stand up to the big lie in a very meaningful way at an important time. But yes, I do believe that there are a sufficient number of Republicans who will stand up and say, no way, we're not going to do this. And I especially think, given the lessons from the past, right, and that ugly day, January 6, 2021, I think there are enough people who are going to say, we're not going to do that all over again. We're going to move forward as a country.
Former Congressman Carlos Curbelo and Fernand Amandi, thank you both. Nice to see you.
Donald Trump appears to have insulted recipients of the Medal of Honor. The comment was one of the first things he said when speaking at an event yesterday at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, about anti-Semitism, while praising Miriam Adelson, who he awarded the Medal of Freedom back in 2018. He then argued the civilian award is better than the one that is given to soldiers.
I have to say, Miriam, I watched Sheldon sitting so proud in the White House when we gave Miriam the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the highest award you can get as a civilian. It's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, but civilian version. It's actually much better because everyone gets the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's soldiers. They're either in very bad shape because they've been hit so many times by bullets, or they're dead. She gets it, and she's a healthy, beautiful woman. It's very...
Mike, I don't know in the history of American politics anybody that I've ever heard say anything remotely as callous as that, but it does line up with what General Kelly, his longest-serving chief of staff, said, that he told him he just didn't understand why people would serve and sacrifice for their country, and also what Jeffrey Goldberg, in quoting people that served with Donald Trump, talking about how Donald Trump said that people who died were losers and suckers, and he didn't want to go to the cemetery. Here you have him saying, you know, the civilian honor is a lot better than the military honor, because to get the military honor, you're either shot up or dead. I do wonder what all of those Medal of Honor winners who have sacrificed so much and the families of fallen American heroes think when they hear a former commander-in-chief say that.
You know, Joe, we just lost a Medal of Honor recipient who died a few days ago, maybe a week ago, Colonel Bucha, B-U-C-H-A. Look up his obituary, read his obituary. He was awarded, you never win any medal. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his capacity to take care of the men who were serving under him during a fight raging in the jungle of Vietnam. You should read his obituary for the extraordinary things Colonel Bucha did after he left the service. So there's that. There's also what we just witnessed, what we just heard from the former president of the United States. We've alluded to this before. He is a uniquely damaged individual, a solitary individual who cannot understand the concept of belonging to a group, whether it's a group of people, voters, of individuals. He can't understand it. He's all about himself. He's a solo act. And Susan Glasser, you've been covering him now for probably too many years in your mind, writing about him, probably too much in your mind. But this capacity of this man to not understand others because his focus is always on himself is truly astounding to a lot of people.
Yeah, Mike, you know, I really appreciate your comment there about the fallen soldier. It reminds me when we were reporting our book about Trump in the White House, another example. Remember how he wanted to hold a military parade? He came back from France in the Bastille Day parade. Well, according to our reporting, he said there was one thing he really didn't like about the Bastille Day parade in France, and that was that there was a group of soldiers, honored French soldiers in that parade who had lost limbs, who were in wheelchairs and the like. And Trump said, I don't want that in my parade. It doesn't look good for me. And of course, the shocked advisor said, what are you talking about, sir? Those are the most honored soldiers, those who sacrificed for their country. And Donald said, yeah, I don't want it. It doesn't look good for me. And I'm reminded of that in those comments yesterday. You know, he believes somehow that those who sacrifice for their country are not whole, are not, you know, rather than being brave, he sees them as, quote, suckers and losers. And you know, this campaign, I think, is once again casting in sharp relief the idea of Trump and the questions around his fitness for office. Trump can't stop from putting those questions squarely in front of the American voters. And especially now that Biden has dropped out, it seems to me that it's Trump himself who's making the issue of his capacity for office, his erratic personality, the issue of the campaign.
You know, Donnie, we talk on this show a lot, and this week even, about the numbness to what Donald Trump says and does from the public, from the media, frankly, many times. When he said what he said about John McCain in 2015, it was viewed as totally disqualifying. It's over for him. It wasn't, it turned out. And that was one of the early warning signs that he was going to do well and survive that. But man, when he stops, for those of us who honor the service of veterans and people who are injured and die in war, for those of us who have family members whose lives were forever altered by a war that he dodged, well, you have to stop and point out again and ask people who support him, do you agree with that? Are you okay with that, the way he's talking about our veterans?
Yeah, he didn't, according to Kelly, he didn't want to see, amputees on stage. He threw his course. I'll tell you another thing that he said that just continues to offend me when he talks about what a good Jew is and how a Jew should vote. And first of all, I'm a proud Jew, and I'm a proud Democrat, voting Democrat. and what a good Jew is about. Donald Trump, you know nothing about being selfless, about being empathetic, about doing for others. You're the antithesis of what Judaism stands for. And I'm so tired of people telling me automatically the Republicans are good for Israel and the Democrats not. The Biden administration has let Israel prosecute this war in every single way they need to prosecute it. And Donald Trump's solution has been end it fast. That's been his solution. And Kamala Harris has come out and said that Israel needs to defend itself. They need to go after terrorists. Yes, she said they need to do it in a humane way, and she's been concerned about humanitarian efforts. As a Jew, I'm okay with that. So I'm tired of this head fake about Republicans are better for the Jews than the Democrats. It's just not true.
Well, Susan, you have a new piece online this morning for The New Yorker entitled Kamala Harris's Best Campaign Surrogate is Donald Trump. And in it, you write in part, quote, practically every time Donald Trump has opened his mouth since Joe Biden stepped aside, the ex-president has made the case for his own manifest unfitness for office. What better assistance could Kamala Harris ask for? Consider just the past few days. On Sunday, Trump actually claimed in a social media post that Harris's campaign had faked a crowd of 15,000 people who had showed up for a recent rally at a Detroit airport hangar. On Monday night, in a 2-hour conversation on X with its owner, Elon Musk, Trump went off on so many tangents that it was almost a relief when he mentioned his apparent plan to self-exile to Venezuela if he lost to Harris. By Wednesday, in a speech in North Carolina, Trump once again made a mockery of Republican leaders who have been publicly pleading with him to abandon personal attacks on the vice president in favor of a more substantive, policy-focused case for himself. In a press conference on Thursday afternoon, Trump mocked Harris as a communist who is going to ruin the entire world if she is elected. When Trump began attacking Harris in earnest a couple of weeks ago, she condemned his remarks about her racial background as the same old show. I say let the show play on for at least a few more months. Every time Trump talks, he's making the case for her. And, you know, I get the feeling, Susan, the campaign knows that because they do a lot of his quotes on social media and just sort of respond with one or two words.
Yeah, I noticed yesterday that they actually promoted Trump's press conference in advance and sent out a press release giving the time and date and location of the press conference yesterday. And, you know, you're not going to be going out on a limb at this moment in the Trump arc if you predict that he's going to say some, you know, weird and bizarre and nonsensical things in public. You know, he can't stop himself from seeking the spotlight. And what's striking to me is that Kamala Harris's political imperative and Donald Trump's personal imperative have now collided. He has a personal need to constantly be in the subject, to change the story if it's ever about his opponent. And she has a need for this election to be about Donald Trump and his fitness for office and not about herself. And I think that it's those two things that are converging right now in this remarkable campaign.
You know, Donnie, I just wanted to check this to make sure. You know, Donald Trump goes around and he does say that if you're a Jew and you don't vote for him, you're a bad Jew. I just went back and I checked the numbers after your statement. In 2020, 77% of the Jewish vote voted for Joe Biden. Only 21% voted for Donald Trump. And even in the run-up to the 2024 election, when Joe Biden was the candidate, 72% of Jewish voters said they were going to vote for Joe Biden, and only 22% for Donald Trump. So all we hear, and we always hear it in the media, and we hear it about how, you know, Donald Trump is going to win a huge number of black voters. He's going to win a huge number of Jewish voters because he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He's going to win this. He's going to win that. It just never pans out. I mean, you know, Kamala Harris is going to, I would be surprised if she didn't get 74%, 75% of the Jewish vote this year. I'd be very surprised if that weren't the case in the years to come as well.
I couldn't agree with you. I'm glad you brought those stats. 3/4 of Jews vote Democrat, have voted Democrat.
So he's saying 3/4 of Jews in America are bad Jews because they don't vote for him.
Yeah, this is the man that said they were good people on both sides of Charlottesville. And Donald Trump is the most transactional human being alive. And I think he would sell anybody down the river, including Israel. I believe nothing he says. And as I said, 3/4 of Jews vote Democrat. They will continue to. And it's a head fake, this automatic, this is what Jews should do. Shame on you, Donald Trump. It's disgusting.